Hello again, everybody. Welcome to part 4 of our Chapter 3 lecture series. This section entitled The Growth of Colonial America. And I do want you to take a moment to note this map here and see not only how the spread of colonization is making its way westward in this period, but also note the variation in the ethnic origins of the colonists. You have not only English, you have French, German, Dutch, Africans, of course, Scots, Irish, Highland Scots, and even some Jews, some Swedes, some Welsh, and French Huguenots, all mixing and intermingling in these eastern North American English colonies. The focus question for this section is, what were the directions of social and economic change in the 18th century colonies? As previously noted, the American colonists in this period had a very diverse population, not just within the English colonies of North America, but on a wider scale on North America as a whole, because you really had this meeting ground of three large international empires, the Spanish, the French, the British, all with differing characteristics, all who left profound legacies, not only culturally, but socially and politically, in place long after the empires were gone from the North American continent. This period of the early 18th century to the mid-18th century saw a huge population increase. You had particularly a huge increase among the African and non-English percentage of the population as the immigration from those areas surged, particularly Germans, Scots, and Scotch-Irish, who the Scotch-Irish were essentially Scots who had immigrated to Ireland about a couple of centuries to a century before and had established a kind of divergent Scotch-Irish culture in their region of Ireland, who then moved on to North America, or at least some of them did during this period. The total English immigration actually declined in this period as the first birth pangs, if you will, of the Industrial Revolution in England made labor in England more valuable, and their surplus population not as inclined or incentivized, if you will, to immigrate into the American colonies. Now, England welcomed foreign settlers at this period as long as they were Protestant. Catholics were still not exactly welcome. And there was also an increase in this period of a phenomenon known as transportation. Now, this was actually a criminal sentence handed down by English courts that sentenced criminals to be literally transported across the Atlantic into the Americas, where they were used as essentially a slave labor force, primarily in Virginian tobacco. And this phenomenon would continue almost up until right at the beginning of the American Revolution, where thousands and thousands of English criminals were exported or forced to immigrate into the Americas to, well, two reasons: help meet the labor demands in the American colonies, but also rid England itself of this troublesome population. The largest group of immigrants into the English American colonies during this period were actually Germans. They were attracted by freedom of religion and the availability of land in the Americas. They mostly migrated as family units, some as indentured servants, the entire family unit. This phenomenon was known as the redemptioners, and they tended to settle in frontier areas where they could spread out and they weren't as surrounded by the English population, and they actually established whole German towns with their own German language newspapers and churches and institutions that were really very separate from the English-speaking population at the time. Now, slowly over time, these populations would merge and assimilate, but even into the early period of United States history, we still see a lot of these pockets of German communities spread throughout what at the time was Western America, just east of the Mississippi River. Now, this period also saw an explosion of religious diversity, however, very distinctly with a Protestant flavor to it. Now, most colonies did not recognize the separation of church and state. The Anglican Church was the state-supported church and was supported by the government via taxes on the colonists, whether they were members of the Anglican Church or not. Now, there was de facto toleration of Protestant denominations. Jews and Catholics, and often still Quakers, except for Pennsylvania, of course, were still discriminated against. However, Protestant denominations, particularly around the period known as the Great Awakening, which actually began in the 1730s and would continue into the 1770s, which saw a flowering of evangelical Protestant Christianity. Now, this gentleman right here was actually an English minister named George Whitefield, who traveled to the American colonies at this time and spent a couple of years traveling through the colonies and spreading this new brand of evangelical Protestantism that really took hold and saw a flowering of religious belief and Protestant denominations in the period. This period was the period of the traveling ministers, of the revival movement, like the large-scale tent revivals that people conjure up in their minds when they think about evangelical Christian ministries. Some of the new denominations that spread around at this time included Lutherans, Mennonites, Anabaptists, and Moravians, which were primarily German-based Protestant denominations, a reflection of that influx of German migration at this period. But you also see Baptists and Presbyterians proliferate during this period. The Baptists in particular were very strong evangelical Christians, and this was really a new denomination that was emerging at this time. The Presbyterians were essentially the Scottish Church, the Scottish form of Protestantism at this time. All of these began to grow and really sink their structures into American society at this time, and religion became more and more important to the day-to-day lives of the average American at the time. It also saw the coalescing of very distinct regional cultures and societies within the larger framework of the English colonies at the time. Of course, you had New England, which was primarily focused on family farms who produced for local consumption. Very few slaves in the New England economy. And you also had the New England merchants who were oriented toward international trade. Then you had the middle colonies, who generally practiced farming for commerce, for export. You know, they were really the partners of those New England merchants. And they had a mix of slave and waged labor, which kind of reflected that middle ground in which they existed between the New England kind of lifestyle and the more southern lifestyle. You also had the backcountry, this area that is denoted really here on this map, that really stretch all the way from Maine down into what would become Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, that area there. These were the frontier areas, and large amounts of people began to move into these regions at this time as the population centers along the coast began to fill up and land became more scarce there. Here again, you had a focus on family farms that were self-sufficient, very little for local consumption and even less for international trade. And of course, very few slaves in that backcountry region as well. Then you also had the Greater South, which had a growing reliance on slave labor for the production of staple crops, which really shaped Southern society to a large degree, and this relationship between the free and enslaved population really gave the South a very different character from all of these other diverse regional experiences. Period of the early to mid 18th century also saw the explosion in what became known as the consumer or the market revolution. Now, there was a steadily increasing standard of living in the American colonies at the time, and the access to British trade guaranteed by the Navigation Acts and British mercantilism ushered in a consumer revolution as people with more money to spend, or more excess money to spend, began to demand more and more manufactured British trade goods. Things such as this fine tea set that you see here. Merchant shops began to proliferate in the towns and cities of the region, and the merchant class grew greater and greater in status and power, particularly in New England. Items once considered luxuries became consumer staples, like tea, like coffee. You know, before this consumer revolution, these things were priced way above the standard that most could achieve. But thanks to the consumer revolution and this increase in standard of living, this increase in income, these things became more affordable and became really cornerstones of early American colonial lifestyles and economies. Now, this consumer or market revolution really set this growing Atlantic economy that had been steadily increasing since Columbus first landed in the Americas up to this period into overdrive. And people, ideas, goods flowed back and forth across the Atlantic at an unprecedented rate. The American colonies became the primary market for British manufacturers. And despite the growing ethnic diversity due to the influx of immigrants at this time, this Atlantic commerce really bound the colonies closer to the mother country and also created a more distinctly English air to colonial culture and society, despite the ethnic diversity, as people began to more and more plug in to that English Atlantic economy and want to be a part of this consumer revolution and this growing socio-political economic sphere that now encompassed all of the Atlantic. Access to the growing British commercial empire certainly enriched the colonies. This map here illustrates what is known as the triangular trade that really defined this period of commerce. You had raw materials from the colonies that were then exported to the mother country, who manufactured them into manufactured goods, who then sent these manufactured goods to Africa, who then traded those to African merchants for enslaved peoples, who then sent those back over to North America. And of course, not just North America, and certainly not primarily North America, but all of the Americas. And of course, there were other legs of this trade as well, but that triangle from North America to Britain to Africa and then back to the Americas really was the cornerstone of this triangular trade at this period. Of course, there was considerable trade with the Caribbean, The slave economies in the Caribbean couldn't produce enough of their own food, so they relied very heavily on trade, particularly with the North American English colonies, to supply their necessities in that regard. And this was allowed through a lax enforcement of the Navigation Act, which allowed smuggling to continue to proliferate at the time and became the basis for the policy that was known later as salutary neglect, which would have a profound impact on the lead up to the American Revolution, as we shall shortly see. That concludes part 4 of our Chapter 3 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.